is the first time we've done a featured review quite like this, as we are doing an anniversary review. It's not really necessarily something that was worth a full deep dive, but we are definitely reviewing it, and it's something we've all seen leading into this, which is also new. That we're doing just a retro review here, and I'm really excited for this. We are reviewing for the 100th anniversary Charlie Chaplin's The Kid, uh, a remarkable movie made back in 1921. It's just crazy that we have feature films that are now 100 years old. So we're talking about The Kid here, and I'm going to start out talking about this one, and we'll kind of give a regular review of it, and then go into maybe some significance of it. So, The Kid is Charlie Chaplin's first feature film that he starred in, wrote, directed, and he plays his lovable tramp who finds a baby in his just around the corner from his house that's been abandoned that through some random circumstances, and there's a note that says, please take care of this orphan child, and he decides to take that to heart and does, and raises the kid for 5 years, treats him to be a little bit of a con artist with him because he's the tramp, so he's not necessarily the most honest and upright citizen there is. And then as the movie goes along, the mother is trying to find her son again after abandoning him, and eventually makes something of her life, and you kind of see the stories kind of intertwine there. This movie is barely an hour long. In fact, I think the version I watched was actually under an hour, which I thought was interesting because it's listed as an hour 8, but it was under an hour. This is available kind of all over the place. It's on HBO Max. It's on, what else was it on? It was on Canopy. It was on Criterion Channel. I think it's on Prime. This movie it shows everything that's great about Charlie Chaplin and everything that's great about Charlie Chaplin films. I heard a story one time that him and Buster Keaton used to compete over who could make a film with the least amount of title cards, dialogue cards, and it shows, because one of the things that I love about Charlie Chaplin's movies is you don't really need the title cards to understand what's going on. I mean, they only pop up when it is absolutely necessary because he's so good at emoting. And one of the things I think is a standout in this movie is the performance of Jackie Cooper, who plays the child. I'd forgotten just how amazing this kid is in this performance. Like, there's a scene where he's being taken away and he's in the truck, and just that, like, 10-15 seconds that you have of him crying for Charlie Chaplin to come get him is one of the best bits of child acting I've seen on screen, like, of all time. And it was probably one of the first times we saw something like that on screen. It's a remarkable film. It's a classic for a reason. It was apparently the inspiration for Adam Sandler's Big Daddy. However, I did check; it's not officially given any adaptation credits in the film. However, it's undeniably inspired by this. So yeah, it's a 4-star masterpiece for me. It's Charlie Chaplin doing what Charlie Chaplin does, and that's where I stand on this one. Todd, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I love this movie too. I don't think it's Chaplin's best movie, but it's a little different because it's like it's more delicate than his other stuff. Like, I mean, it makes it more like somber and sincere, which is just a different kind of Chaplin experience, and I really like that. And so much happens in an hour, like, of this movie. Like, you really can't look away because you'll probably miss something kind of key. But what I also love is how much is going on in the background of all these shots. Like, usually in a silent movie, especially, like, you'll focus on the actors, but like what's going on behind everything else is also really interesting. And like every shot has an idea in the movie. And Chaplin, he's awesome. He wears his emotions like on his sleeve again, and with his body language better than basically any actor ever. And I think he probably was a pretty good athlete. Like, he contorts his body in the weirdest ways, and like his hips move like Barry Sanders. Like, I bet he could have played a football player. But the only real quibble I have with the movie is like when they do have the subtitles, there's this like corny drawing behind it, and makes it almost impossible to read what it actually says. But and the end like dream sequence thing is sort of like Wild at Heart-ish. It works for some reason, but it's kind of bizarre. But yeah, the movie it's like sentimental, but it's not really sappy, and it's like funny without being goofy. And yeah, it's a great movie. 3.5 stars for me.
All right, Zach, you're the actual film student here. Tell us your thoughts on the kid.
Well, at one point I was.
At one point,
not anymore.
You're the film teacher.
Yeah, well, when we would talk about this film in like film 101 class, it was usually we wouldn't show the whole thing usually, but like it was worth talking about in regard to Chaplin's use of pathos, as you guys have kind of already alluded to. Like, this was the first time that it wasn't just a slapstick comedy the whole time. I mean, you had real dramatic undercurrents in this movie. You had the scene where Jackie Coogan is crying and Chaplin throws the thing on the police officer and runs after him. Allegedly, this movie was based on the fact that Chaplin had lost a child himself. And yeah, there's real drama in it, and actually you see that drama also later in particularly City Lights. I mean, City Lights is a hilarious movie, but also I think one of the most like amazingly beautiful endings of all time. I mean, Chaplin was clearly an artist as well as a comedian. And yeah, one of the things that sticks out to me too, kind of like what Todd was saying, there's a lot going on in the frame in this movie. There's a lot of like decisions that are very artistic and aesthetically inspired rather than cheap. You look at the comedies, those like 1 or 2 real comedies from the 1910s, the Max Sennett Keystone Cops movie and the Fatty Arbuckle movies, and even some of the Max Linder movies. Like, they're funny, but they're basically a one joke premise. And in this movie, which is a feature length movie, which obviously is very different than anything that Chaplin had previously done, like, there's attention to the detail, like the chase on the rooftop, when he's running after the kid in the car. That's like an amazing, beautiful sequence with a lot of production design elements that look really good. Even like the alleyway where they have the fight sequence, and then the little apartment itself, which I think was one of the most iconic locations in any silent movie. It's a classic movie. I would agree it's not my favorite Chaplin movie. I think it's either, for me, it's City Lights or Modern Times, but like, this is clearly a stepping stone in his career. He was perfectionist. Allegedly, this movie took about 5 years to make. It took a long time to get the financing. He got the financing out of Italy because most American studios didn't believe that moviegoers would want to see a drama, a feature-length drama, and the movie paid huge dividends. One of the interesting things about Charlie Chaplin too, I remember reading, and I've never seen the Richard Attenborough film, which I think we talked about last week, but Chaplin didn't lose a lot of money in the Depression because he didn't really believe in banks, and I believe he had all of his money just in bills, and so was able to kind of recoup any money income he was able to make. But he didn't embrace talkies after 1928, like Modern Times, City Lights, The Great Dictator. Those are all after 1928. Those are all in the sound era. So kudos to him for believing in the power of silent movies. And I think this movie really holds well. And I think it would hold well with audiences, even young audiences today who really haven't been exposed to many silent films.
I watched it with my 5-year-old. He loved it.
Yeah, it moves quickly. It's pretty, easy to follow, but it's impactful and it's emotional. Mm-hmm. And Jackie Coogan was pretty famous too because he actually made a lot of money as a kid, but I believe his mother and stepfather squandered all of his money, and as a result, they made the Coogan Law, which is that until an actor turns 18 or something like that, they have to, keep the actor's money in a certain place, and there are strings attached to how it's spent. So, in some ways, that's also sort of an influential film history aspect of this film.
I will say it's not my favorite Chaplin either. That I think Modern Times is my favorite. I mean, that one, it's got so much going on, and it's the silliest, but it might also be the most one of the more biting social commentaries as well. And yeah, that one's just brilliant. But this definitely, I mean, being his first feature-length film, at least his first, that was all him. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's interesting that this movie was made 100 years ago. And, in a lot of ways, we talk about how narratives in filmmaking and visual storytelling are changing all the time. And I think we're kind of resistant to it. We don't talk a lot about, the extended universes of miniseries or things like that. But like what he was doing in 1921 was maybe not too different from what, like, for example, Barry Jenkins is doing with Underground Railroad, like exploring these stories in a lot more depth and detail than what audiences were used to before. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting to see that, new innovations in storytelling may look different, but the idea of innovating storytelling is still the same even after 100 years.
I mean, you could say that Charlie Chaplin like invented indie films too, because he told stories that were impactful by doing less. And that's like what the whole indie movement is about, is tell a story and make a point without necessarily hitting you over the head with it, without over sensationalizing everything. And I think The Kid is definitely an example of doing as little as possible, but still to bring about such a great story.
Yeah, and where I thought you were going with that is that he was also an indie in the sense that he formed his own studio, United Artists, with Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks. But that was a little different. That was, I think, a little after this movie. But yeah, I mean, he was like a total auteur. I would also say like one of cinema's first auteurs. Like there's a distinctive, discernible style to his movies, and of course his comic persona, Chaplin-esque. And I don't know. Do you think is he greater than Buster Keaton? Because I love Buster Keaton too, and like this is right around the time of Buster Keaton's movies, like Our Hospitality and Sherlock Jr. and some of the other ones. But like, I mean, to me, Buster Keaton had the greater gags, but Chaplin was maybe the greater filmmaker.
I'd say that's fair. I probably enjoy Chaplin's films more. I think the thing that you got to remember about Buster Keaton too is, I think Buster Keaton started doing this before Charlie Chaplin. Like I think The General was like 19. Oh, I'm gonna get it wrong.
The General was 26.
Oh, 1926. Okay. So then, yeah, full contemporaries, but he was making his own films, writing and directing too. But the thing that's different about the two of them is, after The General, Buster Keaton lost that, and he had to go into the studio system, and he never made another Keaton original again, where Charlie Chaplin was able to keep what was his for his entire career. And that's and I think that's why his films are remembered in such higher esteem, and the fact that pretty much all of his films he played the same character, just in completely different situations and circumstances. In a lot of ways Buster Keaton kind of did the same thing too, but Charlie Chaplin transformed himself and made himself an icon in his look. Todd, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen as much Keaton as I've seen Chaplin, but yeah, I mean, I agree with you guys basically. And I mean, I think Chaplin was probably a better actor. I think the style of Keaton is a little bit more difficult to shoot, but I mean, Chaplin's movies are so distinct. Like the exec said, he was basically the first auteur. So I don't know. I haven't seen as many silent movies as I probably should, but
yeah, Keaton was a little bit more of a physical comedian. And willing to go all out to get the shot. I mean, I think Steamboat Bill Jr., where the whole house falls on top of him and he's in the window. I mean, that's he did that. Yeah, he was much more the physical presence, where Chaplin was maybe more the storyteller.
Yeah.
What about you, Zach?
Oh, I mean, I grew up probably more with Buster Keaton's movies, so I'm a little more biased toward maybe Keaton. I think Keaton had a more prodigious output, maybe. But I think the biggest difference is that Chaplin like told stories, whereas Keaton's movies are much more kind of focused on the gags themselves, like you said. You're right, the house falling on him, or him going through and Steamboat Bill Jr. going like through the boats. And, crazy shit like that. I mean, getting shot out of a cannonball. I mean, I think there were limits to like what Chaplin would be willing to do, and Harold Lloyd to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
But Chaplin did some cool stuff too. I always like to show my students the clip of in modern times when they're rollerblading in the abandoned grocery store.
Oh yeah,
because everyone thinks that shit's real, and it's not. It was a hanging mat. It was like a cool special effect. But both of them were also really big pioneers in early special effects, which makes their movie stand out too in a lot of cool ways.
At the same time, Keaton, a lot of his were like the house actually did fall on him.
Oh yeah.
And like in the general, he actually had an entire like water tower full of water fall on top of him.
Well, it was a $2 million gag when the train collided. I mean, it was the most expensive shot in movie history too.
Yeah.
But they did use a lot of like forced perspective. Like Harold Lloyd, you know, in Safety Last wasn't like going over. Right. It was like a forced perspective shot. But you know, it looks pretty realistic even today, which says something about, you know, practical effects versus CGI, I guess.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right.
Anyway, I've not seen Chaplin. Is it worth watching? Every time I put it on, I've fallen asleep. I find it insufferably boring. But I do think that Robert Downey Jr. it looks a lot like Charlie Chaplin.
It is stunning what he's able to do in that performance. I will say that. I could see how it could get a little boring. But I love the movie. It's one of my favorite movies of that year, and I find it a movie that is so educational and giving you some of that backstory of who Charlie Chaplin was and how he became who he was. Especially being told by a guy like Richard Attenborough, who definitely told real stories, and told them well.
But the problem I have with that movie is it's just like the backstory of him, you know, brushing shoulders with Douglas Fairbanks and other famous people in Hollywood. It's like I've never been like compelled by the actual filmmaking in the movie itself. It seems more like a social biography of the people that he hobnobbed with. But maybe I haven't seen the whole thing. That's you know, that's why I get bored of it.
It's been a while since I've watched it too, so it might be something that.
It was on TCM just a couple weeks ago, and I wanted to watch it. And I was like, this is not that great, unfortunately. But Robert Downey Jr. it was great.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is our anniversary review, our 100th anniversary review of Charlie Chaplin's The Kid.